5. Stories from the pages of time. Stories of triumph and tragedy, adventure and achievement, as we go in search of history. It's a slim volume mysteriously titled The Protocols of the Learned Elders of Zion, and it is arguably one of the most influential works of the 20th century. Henry Ford believed it was a wake-up call for America. Winston Churchill was once convinced it was true. The Nazis used it as a warrant for genocide. This is the story of a hoax that will not die. It has fooled millions of people all over the world for more than a century and continues to be a powerful force of evil and hate. Join us as we go in search of history to uncover a deadly deception. January 1922. Walter Rathenau, Germany's Minister of Foreign Affairs, a Jew, is assassinated in Berlin by Hermann Fischer and an accomplice. At trial, they declare that Rathenau had to be killed because he was one of the Elders of Zion. But who are the Elders of Zion? According to this book, the Elders of Zion are an elite group of Jewish leaders whose sole purpose is to take over the world by controlling the hearts, minds, and money of the Gentile world. And the book purports to quote directly from this invented group of Jewish leaders.
Throughout all Europe and in other continents also, we must create riots, discord, and hostility, but we must use great cunning so the non-Jews will accept us as their benefactors and the saviors of the human race.
These words are quoted from a mysterious little book that first starts circulating underground in Russia around 1897. It is titled The Protocols of the Learned Elders of Zion. Its author and origin are unknown to this day. The Protocols, as the book is commonly called, contains the minutes of a clandestine meeting held by a group of Jewish leaders, the so-called Learned Elders of Zion. Through the minutes, readers learn that the elders' sole purpose is to infiltrate every corner of society with the ultimate aim of world conquest.
The Protocols of the Elders of Zion purport to be the verbatim, word-for-word record of 24 speeches that were delivered by the so-called chief sage.
Ever written. But channel. Frankenstein, one of the greatest horror stories ever written. But Frankenstein is more than mere fiction, written to thrill and fascinate. Inspired by real events, it captured the dark side of a period of revolutionary upheaval and provided an eerily accurate vision of the future. Come with us, if you dare, as we go in search of history and uncover the story behind the story of Frankenstein. It is a chilling story of mythic proportions. A scientist assembles a gruesome figure made up of body parts stolen from cemeteries. Then, reaching into the sky, he captures an elemental force of nature and claims the power reserved to God. Frankenstein is not the monster, but the scientist Victor Frankenstein. And the monster is never called a monster in the novel in which he first appears as a character. He is the creature, or the being. Unlike versions of the story told in early theater productions and then in the movies, the creature is born innocent and good. Only later, confronted by the world's evil, does he turn to murder and mayhem. It is this original version of the creature which is rooted in the time of the novel's creation, early in the 19th century. The world was still coming to terms with ideas which had spawned revolutionary movements.
Some of the ideas in Frankenstein were definitely inspired by the same types of writings that inspired the leaders of the French and American revolutions. The fact that people are born good, born innocent, and that if they become evil, it's because of the injustices visited upon them.
The passionate arguments continued in the wake of the revolution. Was man inherently good or evil? Was he created by God? Or by mindless forces which men could harness to their own purpose? In Frankenstein, these arcane arguments about the nature of man became a dramatic, horrifying narrative. Perhaps one of the most astonishing things about the book is that the author who accomplished this brilliant transformation was a 19-year-old girl. Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley.
I think she may be the only single writer who's ever created a myth entirely herself, the myth of what we now call Frankenstein, of the scientist who gives birth to a monster that destroys him.
The summer of Mary's birth in London on August 30th, 1797, was marked by violent electrical storms. Fireballs raced across the sky. Strangely, lightning would accompany many crucial passages in Mary's life. 11 days after she was born, Mary's mother, the writer and political reformer Mary Wollstonecraft, died from complications of childbirth. The young Mary was left with a painful loss, but also something more.
She left her daughter a twofold legacy. On the one hand, her writings, both the ones that had been published as well as the writings in manuscript, letters, diaries, all sorts of things were left. But she left her another legacy. She left her the legacy of an ideal.
Mary Shelley's mother was probably the first and most famous feminist in history. And even though Mary's mother died when she was born, her father nonetheless continued to be a center of radical politics, feminist politics. And that's the atmosphere in which Mary grew up, surrounded by people who supported the goals, for example, of the French Revolution, who supported ideas of equality, equality among classes, and also equality between men and women.
Revolutions were also occurring in science. particularly in the spectacular new field called electricity.
The electricity was in the air, no pun intended. There was a lot of interest in the scientific community in electricity. Electricity as a power source and electricity as a possible source of life.
The ferment of new ideas in all fields was a part of the household in which Mary was raised. Her father, writer William Godwin, was famous for hosting the most extraordinary thinkers of the age. At Godwin's gatherings, poets such as Wordsworth and Coleridge mingled easily with scientists and inventors. Godwin's guests included the reigning poets and scientists, in addition to an endless stream of writers, musicians, and inventors.
When one thinks of the great minds of this period, I mean, we in our modern era tend to separate people out. You know, oh, well, you're a great philosopher, you're a great writer, you're a great scientist. But in fact, in that period, the lines were not so clear.
Instead, people called themselves natural philosophers or natural historians because they were very concerned with the big picture, the big questions of what is the nature of life, what's the nature of the universe.
As the new science of electricity developed, Mary heard her father's guests tell bizarre but true stories of stolen corpses and clandestine experiments in hidden laboratories. Three of her father's fellow intellectuals had a particular influence on Mary: Erasmus Darwin, Humphrey Davy, and Luigi Galvani.
Erasmus Darwin actually developed the theory of the evolution of the species, for which his nephew usually gets the credit.
Conversations swirled around Darwin's analysis of the birth process and the exact biological way in which the male and female elements combine. He also predicted the possibility of mutation resulting in a monster, a theme which would prove central to the story of Frankenstein. While Erasmus Darwin suggested that nature was a slow evolutionary process, there was another young thinker at the table, Humphrey Davy, who argued that new life forms might be instantly created by chemical means. It was the scientist Galvani who planted the seeds of the possibility of reanimation, the ability to bring the dead back to life in the mind of young Mary. In 1803, it was Galvani's nephew, Giovanni Aldini, who brought the corpse of executed murderer Thomas Forster to a crowded London theater.
He laid the dead corpse on the operating table. Huge electricity through him, and this corpse then sat up, opened up his eyes, clenched his fist, and this is, of course, the prototype for Victor's creation.
Clearly, the groundwork for Frankenstein had been laid in Mary's mind. Her creativity would soon be unleashed in the throes of a passionate love affair with an extravagant, romantic poet. In May 1814, the 17-year-old Mary fell in love. Percy Bysshe Shelley walked into her life. He was a 21-year-old poet who possessed a well-earned reputation as a renegade. As a boy, Percy attempted to cure his sister's frostbite with a charge from a battery. He electrocuted the family cat. Later, despite his family's money connections, he was thrown out of Oxford for defending atheism. One night, Percy attended one of Godwin's dinners.
In May, Shelley came to call. He idolized not only William Godwin, but he was also a great admirer of Mary Wollstonecraft. And here was their golden-haired daughter, who was really an intellectual match for him.
17-year-old Mary possessed the attractive combination of her mother's brilliance and her father's wisdom, set in the countenance of a fair-skinned girl with penetrating gray eyes. The couple began to spend every day together, going for long walks and discussing their mutual passions for politics and women's rights. She showed him samples of her writing, and Percy encouraged Mary to do more. Mary's intellect was as attractive to Shelley as her looks.
Their union was unusual in that it did permit and encourage a woman's intellect, and that was not the usual kind of relationship.
The relationship was a godsend for Mary, who lived in a time when women were rarely educated. They could not own property. They could not keep their wages from jobs. They were not allowed custody of their children. They were not even allowed standing as legal citizens in the courts of England. But there was a roadblock to this newfound love. Percy Shelley was married with 2 children, and Mary was just 17.
When she eloped with Shelley, you know, she was in a sense fulfilling the philosophical side of her parents' ideas about marriage, but forgetting about the practical side.
Despite these facts, on July 28, 1814, less than 3 months after they met, the couple traveled together to the European continent. Mary was about to take an important step on the path to the creation of Frankenstein. Their trip would serve as the springboard for the writing of Mary's famous novel. The lovers sailed on Germany's Rhine River and made several stops to visit castles and delve into local history. As Mary recorded in her journal in August 1814.
The banks of the Rhine are very impressive. Rocks and mountains crowned with lonely castles. A ruined tower with its desolated windows stood on the summit of another hill that jutted into the river.
On September 2nd, they arrived at the river city of Mannheim. On the way, in the hazy distance, towering on the cliffs above them, Mary may well have caught a glimpse of an eerie, abandoned castle which was owned by a family named Frankenstein. Some believe that Percy and Mary also stopped at a local inn, where they were regaled with stories about a former resident of the castle, an arrogant 17th century alchemist named Johann Conrad Dippel. In 1673, according to the tale, Dippel was born in the Frankenstein castle while it was being used as an army hospital. He grew up not far from the town and returned after attending medical school. Soon after, bodies began disappearing from graves. Rumors circulated that Dippel had a secret laboratory in the castle and brought corpses there for his ghoulish experiments. To this day, some believe these stories helped inspire Mary's notorious Dr. Frankenstein. When Percy and Mary returned home, Mary was pregnant, further compounding the sensational nature of the relationship. Mary was an outcast, just like her ungainly creature. After the birth of their son William, the couple took another step toward the creation of Frankenstein. They left England for Switzerland to spend the summer at Lake Geneva with Mary's stepsister, Claire, and her new lover, the famous Lord Byron.
Byron had recently divorced his wife. It was a great scandal. He'd had to leave England. Claire Clairmont had had an affair with Byron. She was pregnant by him. She persuaded the Shelleys, Percy Shelley and Mary, to come with her. And so they followed Byron to Switzerland, actually, and spent the summer of 1816 with Byron there.
There, the two great poets, Byron and Shelley, met for the first time. The company of young rebels spent their time sailing, reading, arguing the philosophical issues of the day, and making love. Their activities at Lake Geneva that summer created much scandal. They advocated free love and equal rights for women. The more the local townspeople shunned them, the more outrageous they became. Once again, lightning marked a crucial passage in the life of Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley, creator of Frankenstein. In June of 1816, while Mary spent the summer with her lover and friends at Lake Geneva, Switzerland, the weather turned ominous.
Now, it turns out to have been an extremely cold summer because Krakatoa had exploded and had sent so much ash into the air that it was rainy almost every day in Europe that summer.
On June 15th, the heavens let loose. Mary and Percy, Lord Byron, Claire, and Byron's personal physician, Dr. Polidori, stayed up all night watching the awesome display of nature's fury. As Mary later noted in her journal, the group also began reading from a collection of tales.
In the evening, we crowded around a blazing wood fire and amused ourselves with some German stories of ghosts. which happened to fall into our hands.
Lord Byron, the oldest of the group at age 28, proposed that each of them write their own ghost story. Anxious about her writing ability, went to sleep that night determined to create a story that would speak to the mysterious fears of our nature.
And she tells us in her journals, in fact, that she was asleep that night and had a horrible dream. She calls it a reverie. It was probably a waking dream.
I saw the pale student of hallowed arts kneeling beside the thing he had put together. I saw the hideous phantasm of a man stretched out. Then, on the working of some powerful engine, show signs of life.
Moments later in Mary's dream, the creature was standing by her bed. Slowly it drew back the bed curtains and looked at Mary with hideous yellow eyes. Later, as she recounted her terrible vision, Mary knew that the tale she was looking for, the story that would prove her worth as a writer to the other, had been delivered. The creature who had visited her in the dead of night would become known in the world as Frankenstein's monster.
There's no doubt at all that the competition prompted Mary Shelley to demonstrate to these men, however much she loved and admired them, that she, as a young woman, could write something of significance, though it is unlikely that she could have envisioned the persistent significance of Frankenstein.
The next evening, Percy and Byron talked about whether a corpse could be brought back to life. It was a conversation which, as Mary would later recall, triggered the first concrete images of the theme of the Frankenstein story. She later recorded in her journal,
various philosophical doctrines were discussed, and among others, the nature of the principle of life and whether there was any probability of its ever being discovered and communicated. They talked of the experiments of Dr. Darwin.
That same night, Byron told the beginning of a story which was later written and published by Dr. Polidori. It was called The Vampire. Many believe this was the germ of what eventually turned into Bram Stoker's Dracula, the ghoulish demon who was often thought of as Frankenstein's terrible twin. Then on June 18th, near midnight, keeping up the ghostly tone of the last few days, Byron began to recite Samuel Taylor Coleridge's poem, Christabel. But the reading was cut short when Percy Shelley ran screaming from the room. He claimed to have seen a horrifying specter of Mary with eyes on the nipples of her breasts. This macabre vision brought to a dramatic close a short period of intense creativity that was to have an enduring impact on Mary and Percy, as well as the future of horror literature. Beginning in the summer of 1816, Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley worked on the manuscript of Frankenstein. Percy's support proved vital.
Percy Shelley was the one who encouraged her to expand it into a novel. She didn't have that kind of self-confidence, but she was certainly pleased that Percy Shelley thought it was worth developing.
During the writing, Percy's wife, pregnant from an illicit affair, committed suicide by jumping from a bridge in London's Hyde Park. Mary and Percy, having lived together for 2.5 years, were now free to get married. Soon after, Mary became pregnant with their 3rd child. By the time the book was finished, their daughter Clara was born.
Because Mary Shelley was a woman, there are some central parts of women's experience that are at the heart of Frankenstein.
Significantly, Mary set most of her novel in 1797, the year she was born. The story takes 9 months to unfold. But the world into which it was born was still very much a man's world. Percy Shelley and Mary's father, William Godwin, feared that if the book were published under Mary's name, there would be a critical backlash because she was a woman. To avoid any scandal, the manuscript was presented to publishers as having been written by a young friend of Percy's who wished to remain anonymous, a common form of publishing in those days. Incredibly, what would become one of the best-selling novels of all time was turned down by 2 publishers. Finally, the novel was accepted by Percy's publisher and printed in March 1818. Many reviewers believed it was written by Percy or by Godwin, certainly not by Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley.
Happily for us, the manuscripts of much of Shelley's editing of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein exist. Quite recently, a colleague of mine named Charlie Robinson did a meticulous edition. Shelley has not really changed very, very much at all.
On March 11, 1818, the day Frankenstein was finally published, Percy and Mary and the children left for Italy.
There's no evidence, to my knowledge, that she had any idea of the reception that the book would eventually have, and she could not possibly have anticipated its cardinal significance in the years since it first appeared in 1818. Nobody could have anticipated it.
The book was an instant success, a sensation. But Mary had been paid very little for it, and authors of that era rarely received royalties. Tragedy now seemed to stalk the Shelleys. First, their baby daughter Clara died of fever in Venice. Then, a year later, in Rome, their son William succumbed to malaria. For a brief moment, the future seemed bright with the birth of a son, Percy Florence Shelley. The family spent the summer of 1822 at Lerici on the Gulf of Spezia, so that Percy could pursue his favorite pastime, sailing on the Mediterranean Sea. On July 8, 1822, despite warnings of an approaching storm, Percy and a friend set sail from Livorno in Percy's new boat. It was the last time Mary saw her husband. The men's bloated bodies were found 10 days later. Before Mary could see Percy one last time, his body was burned on a funeral pyre as a precaution against the plague. Lord Byron and a handful of friends watched the body burn, then gathered Shelley's unburned heart for Mary, who arrived soon after. The death left her devastated.
In August 1822, just a month after Shelley drowned, Mary Shelley wrote one of the most remarkable letters, I think, ever written. And by the time you get towards the end of the letter, she says to her friend, emanating his remains on the beach, and then she has a phrase, she says, "And I live."
Mary's love of life died with her husband. Nevertheless, attempting to earn a living on her own, she wrote a short story for a friend's controversial magazine, The Liberal, which met with the critical slurs her husband and father had feared. The conservative Blackwood's Edinburgh magazine attacked her with an article which said, "The soprano of a female voice pouring forth the rough notes of Jacobinism." One should think that a female just chastised by a sad calamity might find other modes of consolation than in feeble railing against kings and gods. Mary wrote 4 more novels, but none had the impact of Frankenstein. Her personal fame was completely eclipsed by that of her creation.
It is interesting that later novels of Mary Shelley didn't use her name, but rather said by the author of Frankenstein.
Mary struggled financially for the rest of her life. She survived on her small writing income and a meager stipend from Percy's wealthy father, which she used to help educate her son. She devoted much of her career to editing and publishing her husband's work, helping to ensure an immortal reputation for Percy Bysshe Shelley as one of the greatest of the Romantic poets. She never remarried. In 1851, at the age of 53, Mary Shelley died in London of a brain tumor. That same year, Prince Albert opened the Great Exhibition, a showcase of man's technological progress, the same progress Mary had warned against when she wrote Frankenstein more than 30 years earlier. In one of the novel's most dramatic and horrifying scenes, Frankenstein's monster escapes the control of his creator and lurches out into the world. In much the same way, Mary Shelley's story seemed to make its way in the world as though it had an independent life of its own. By 1823, stage versions were appearing regularly, including parodies. All the versions testify to the story's underlying dramatic strength. It was a stage production that provided the inspiration for Thomas Edison, who made the first Frankenstein movie in 1910. Then, in 1931, an English actor named Boris Karloff gave the most memorable face to Frankenstein's creature. Perhaps inevitably, the movie versions misrepresented key elements of Mary's story. It's in the movies that the creature is born with fury in his heart and remains a brute without a conscience.
Boris Karloff never utters an articulate word through the whole film. And the novel, at least a third of it, is the creature's voice telling us how he feels when he's alone and isolated and abandoned, and also how he feels remorse after he's committed crimes. All that gets lost, of course, from the film traditions.
Since the Karloff version, more than 40 Frankenstein films have been released. And Mary Shelley's masterpiece is now the most widely taught novel in America.
Some people think of Frankenstein as the first work of science fiction, but it is also very much a work about politics, about economics, about philosophy, about morality, because of the types of questions that Victor Frankenstein deals with.
Frankenstein is one of the very first works to suggest negative consequences for scientific and technological advance.
By the middle of the 20th century, it was clear that the Frankenstein story had been prophetic, as though Mary had known scientists really would unleash forces we may not fully understand or be able to control. More recently, scientists have made ever-accelerating progress in mastering and manipulating the elements of life, the very field explored in Frankenstein.
I think what's extraordinary is that it forecasts in so many ways the issues of transition that we face still today, which is why I think that when this great furor came out about cloning of sheep, Dolly, in Scotland, I don't think an article has been published that doesn't refer to the scientist as Frankenstein.
The relevance of the Frankenstein story is only increased by the developing importance in our own time of feminism, the philosophy pioneered by Mary's mother. To many, feminism provides the moral basis of Mary's masterpiece.
One of the things she understood was that the scientific revolution involved a gender politics. Victor, of course, is literally stealing the natural method of reproduction, which involves a woman, in order to reproduce humanity by himself. He's going to be the first man who gives birth to a baby without a woman. I think in her novel, what she really shows is the way in which science, done in that aggressive and even sexist way, can get you into trouble, can actually produce horrors.
Morality is very much an issue in the scientific and technological communities, and if anything is more of an issue today than it has been throughout American history. Are the decisions to be left to the scientists and or the engineers, or are they to be left to decision makers, to elected officials, or to the general public?
If Frankenstein was a message sent to the future by a 19-year-old girl named Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley, what are we to make of one of her later novels, The Last Man? The Last Man envisions a plague which engulfs the world and wipes out the human race. Our past is rich with lessons and warnings we might do well to heed as we go in search of history.
It's alive! It's alive! It's alive! It's alive!
A mad countess who bathed in human blood. A murderous tyrant who dined among his corpses. Both inspired the greatest monster we've ever known.
History records another monster that never really lived, and yet thousands of people were mistaken for it. Judged demons, they ended up victims of one of the worst killing sprees of all time.
In the beginning, there was Adam and Eve and a vampire. According to Hebrew mythology, Lilith was a winged, clawed creature cast out from the Garden of Eden for disobeying Adam. Enraged, she wandered the earth, haunting the dreams of the first mortals. Legend says she feasted on the blood of newborns. Lilith is the first vampire in history, but not the last. The Egyptians believed in a ghost-like vampire who also sucked the blood of children. The Babylonians lived in fear of the blood-sucking Ikimu, a restless soul doomed to spend eternity searching for victims. The Greeks were stalked by the demon Lamia, who donned the guise of a beautiful woman to drink the blood of young men. Today, the vampire remains the monster that will not die.
In our culture, what keeps the vampire myth alive is the seductive power that the vampire has. He's able to have complete control over his victims. But the really special thing about the vampire is the gift that he gives with his seduction: eternal life.
A vampire is basically a person who in the body comes back from the dead and attacks people and drinks their blood. The blood is seen as the carrier of the life force. And by extension, a vampire is then also someone who saps your life force.
The word vampire comes from the Hungarian word vampir, which in turn is rooted in a mythical figure from Slavic folklore called Upir, a spirit who nourished himself by feasting on the living. Hungarians also had a word for a corpse that wouldn't rest: Nosferatu, the undead. Throughout Eastern Europe during the Dark Ages, the myth of the vampire thrived.
The Eastern Orthodox Church didn't put nearly so much pressure on the local population to rid themselves of pre-Christian beliefs. And the Western Church did, the Catholic Church did. So these belief in the vampire has survived much, much better in the East than it has in the West.
In the Middle Ages, all of Europe was ravaged time and again by a real monster. We know it as the bubonic plague. Superstitious Europeans knew it only as an unfathomable terror that left a corpse with a discolored face. They called it the Black Death. Those struck by the plague sometimes lapsed into a coma. Presumed dead, they were often buried alive. Stories spread of corpses clawing their way out of freshly dug graves, breathing new life into the myth of the vampire. Unable to explain the Black Death, much less fight it, Bill blamed the undead.
The vampire of the past was, in a way, a scapegoat. When things went wrong in a village, they would blame the last person who died, and they would dig that person up.
The things that they interpreted as evidence that the body was a vampire were a change in color, and they thought that if the body had turned darker than it had been in life, then it was a vampire.
They would dig them up and they would see the blood on their face, and they would assume that the blood came from drinking from the living, when in fact that was just part of the process of decay.
By the 15th century, the Black Death had wiped out a fourth of Europe's population. Then the killer vanished as mysteriously as it appeared. The vampire might have disappeared with it. Instead, he came alive in one man, a tyrant whose thirst for blood would not be surpassed for 500 years. In the 15th century, the kingdom of Wallachia in what is now Romania was racked by civil war. The king of Wallachia belonged to the Order of the Dragon, a group sworn to fight the Turks in support of the church. He was called Dracul, the word for both dragon and devil. When Dracul was killed in 1447 by his own nobles, the crown passed to his son, Vlad Tepes, called Dracula, literally the son of the devil. No one guessed the boy would live up to his name. Throughout childhood, Vlad had been held hostage by the Sultan of Turkey to keep his father at bay. Released to take the throne, Vlad swore vengeance on his father's killers. He invited them to a great feast, then locked them in the hall and burned it down. He spent the rest of his life wreaking havoc on his enemies, real and imagined. His favorite form of execution was impaling his victims alive on a long, sharpened stake. The stake was then set in the ground, and the victim left to struggle like a worm on a hook in an agonizingly slow death. So many people were executed this way, guilty and innocent, that Vlad acquired the title, the Impaler. He even had a table set among his dying victims so he could dine amid their agony.
Vlad Tepes was not a vampire. He was a bloodthirsty ruler who killed a lot of people. He was as bloodthirsty a ruler as anyone up until Hitler.
Vlad was merciless with wives who were unfaithful, or in his view, just careless. Seeing a peasant with a frayed shirt, Vlad demanded to meet the man's wife. Vlad at once condemned the poor woman to death. Her husband insisted she was a good wife and begged that her life be spared. In vain.
What are you doing?
With the old wife still writhing on the stake, Vlad assigned the grieving peasant a new wife, with the curt order to pay more attention to her husband's attire than her predecessor. As his fame spread, the name Dracula became synonymous with evil. When he died in 1476, his head was cut off and impaled on a stake. Yet Vlad lived on. His murderous life would help inspire the most famous vampire in history. So would the dark deeds of a Hungarian noblewoman with a gift for torture and a thirst for blood. Countess Elizabeth Bathory was born in 1560 to a noble Hungarian family with a history of madness. At 15, she was married to a young nobleman, Ferenc Nasidy. When he went off to war, Elizabeth was left with an empty castle and time on her hands. She soon found a way to fill both. Under cover of darkness, the mad countess and her servants would kidnap peasant girls and whisk them into her dungeon. Once inside, none escaped to tell what happened. Elizabeth was a self-taught sadist, and she learned fast. When her husband returned home, he tolerated her experiments until 1604, when, suddenly and mysteriously, he too died. During one session, Elizabeth was splashed by a victim's blood. she became convinced it made her flesh younger. The Countess soon indulged a new obsession, bathing in the blood of young girls. She had found the key to eternal life. But eternal life required more bodies. The tortures went on. From bathing, it was only one step to drinking. Elizabeth would pierce the flesh of a victim, hoist her up to the rafters, then swallow the blood as it ran down. Elizabeth buried her victims on the grounds of the castle till she ran out of room. Then her servants simply dumped the bodies in the forest. When the villagers began discovering corpses drained of blood, they blamed the deaths on vampires. Bodies continued to appear for several decades until 1610, when the truth reached Elizabeth's cousin, Count Ferzo. He was astounded to learn 650 girls had vanished and were presumed dead. His justice was swift. He executed the servants and sealed Elizabeth in her room. 4 years later, the Blood Countess Elizabeth Bathory died. But the myth of the vampire lived on.
Could you survive a night in a hot...
Revenants, beings who returned from the grave. Then, in 1706, Charles Ferdinand de Schertz wrote the Magia Pashuma, a legal approach to hunting vampires. He included an account of a particularly strong vampire from Bohemia that was stabbed through the heart and burned by the town executioner before it was vanquished. The living protected themselves by wearing silver, long considered magical simply because it was rare. Others wore a cross. Garlic, reputed to be a cure-all, was also prized as a vampire repellent, but its real value lay in masking the odor of decaying flesh as vampire hunters dug up a corpse.
In the second quarter of the 19th century, there was a guy who was making little vampire kits for coping with vampires if you traveled into Eastern Europe. And he had a pistol that you could load with silver balls, and he had garlic in this kit, and he had a combination stake and sword, which I thought was very, very nice.
The first great blow against vampires was struck by a book. In 1746, Dom Augustin Calmet, a French Benedictine monk and biblical scholar, published his best-selling Treatise on Vampires and Revenants. While believing in vampires, Calmet challenged the myths surrounding them, including the notion that a corpse could escape through 5 feet of earth. One of the few voices of reason belonged to a woman, Maria Theresa, Empress of Austria. In 1755, she heard reports from Moravia of widespread grave desecration. The cause? A vampire scare, founded on corpses that hadn't decomposed. She sent her personal doctor to investigate. He discovered the corpses had not decomposed simply because the earth was dry and the weather cold. Maria Theresa banned vampire hunting and ordered reports of vampirism be made to the government, not to the church. Peasants ignored the edict, more fearful of the undead than the police. Just as logic was gaining on the vampire, fiction came to his rescue. In 1819, John Polidori wrote The Vampire, a Gothic novel about a handsome, jaded nobleman who savaged his victims in his thirst for blood. But it was a frustrated writer named Bram Stoker who in 1897 created the vampire that's died 1,000 deaths and still comes back. Reaching back 500 years to the devil incarnate, Vlad the Impaler, Stoker invented the greatest monster in history, Dracula. Stoker had a genius for innovation. Other writers had endowed the vampire with the power to take form of an animal, but Stoker hit upon the perfect beast, the vampire bat. A creature that also hunts by night and lives on blood. He also made the vampire a sex symbol.
The ancient vampire had little to do with sexuality. When Bram Stoker talked about drinking from the neck, that erotic act was really just a substitute for sexual intercourse, which was not permitted to be written about in those days.
In its pristine form, as in Dracula, the vampire is a way of talking about rape without ever mentioning it. The vampire attacks and defiles.
As the years go by, it carries an increasingly larger sexual component. So that the old stories of vampirism were very disgusting, very non-sexual. But as the vampire evolved, he became more handsome, more sophisticated, more powerful, more popular, and the sexual component, the romantic component, became larger and larger.
With the dawn of the 20th century, the vampire was safely imprisoned on the silver screen, where he could do nothing more than give us a nervous night's sleep. Or so we thought. In 1924, Germany was shocked by the crimes of Fritz Haarmann, a butcher shop owner who enticed young boys to his home, where he would kill them with one vicious bite to the neck. Haarmann not only drank the blood of several of his 27 victims, he sometimes ate their flesh. He ground up the bodies of others for sausage and sold it to his customers. In 1949, England executed George Hyde for killing 9 people, drinking their blood, then dissolving their bodies in acid. Newspapers dubbed him the acid bath vampire. The vampire, a creature born entirely of myth, still inspires some of the most ghastly crimes. A teenage vampire cult that moves from drinking each other's blood to cold-blooded murder. Or a rapist who bites his victims and drinks their blood. 5 centuries ago, all such criminals, the butcher shop Dracula and the acid vampire, would have been viewed as real vampires. Yet all were true monsters.
From the time that we're little kids, we're taught what monsters are. Monsters are ugly, evil, completely bad people that grab you, take you away, and maybe gobble you up. Now, if you think about what monsters do, real ones, monsters do things for sex.
I knew I was sick or evil or both. Now I believe I was sick.
In 1992, Jeffrey Dahmer was convicted of killing 17 men and boys. He dismembered their bodies, drank their blood, and ate their flesh. Sentenced to life in prison, he was found too monstrous even by other inmates. In 1994, they bludgeoned him to death. Dracula is still on the loose, but in a watered-down version. Harmless, at least to others. Modern, self-proclaimed vampires who drink human blood.
I am not a Satanist. I have nothing to do with devil worship. I don't attack and kill people. The people that I take blood from are donors, not victims. These are willing people, consenting adults, never an animal, never a child.
I think vampires speak to some very deep levels of our own feelings and consciousness. That's why they have caught on in ways that other monsters have not. I mean, Frankenstein, werewolf, the mummy are all very popular, but you don't have fan clubs for them. You do have fan clubs for the vampire, for Count Dracula, and for Lestat.
The would-be vampire with a quiet taste for human blood inhabits a tiny world, a cult within a cult. He lives not simply on the fringe of society, but beyond it. But then, so did the vampire.
The vampire represents someone who is outside of society, who in a way is powerless because of his own needs to survive. And so it gives people something to identify with. Someone say, oh, he's just like me.
The vampire is the strangest of creatures, a being who never really lived, and yet who exists throughout time. He has died 1,000 deaths, but returns again and again in the guise of a mass murderer and a serial killer. He is a figure of myth and fact. If vampires are simply living monsters, then they still walk among us.
Coming up,
history records another monster that never really lived, and yet thousands of people were mistaken for it. Judged demons, they ended up victims of one of the worst killing sprees of all time.
We're here with the man.
Never really lived, and yet thousands of people were mistaken for it. Judged demons, they ended up victims of one of the worst killing sprees of all time. In 1628, Johannes Junius of Bamberg, Germany, was accused of one of the most foul deeds of his day, witchcraft. He was interrogated by his own brother-in-law. Junius protested he was innocent, but 2 other alleged witches were brought in who claimed they saw Junius at a witches' gathering. Junius was found guilty, but his interrogation continued. His hands were tied behind his back. Then he was hoisted to the ceiling and dropped until his shoulders were dislocated. The torture was repeated 7 more times. Awaiting execution, Junius managed to write a letter to his daughter and bribe a guard to deliver it. The letter still survives. It's a rare account of common cruelty.
Innocent have I come into prison. Innocent have I been tortured. Innocent must I die. For whoever comes into the witch prison must be tortured until he invents something out of his head. The executioner put thumb screws in me, both hands bound together so that the blood ran out of the nails and everywhere, so that for 4 weeks I could not use my hands, as you can see from the writing.
During his torture, Junius was forced to confess to attending gatherings of witches and to poisoning animals. Then he had to accuse innocent men of the same crimes.
Dear child, keep this letter secret, else I shall be tortured most piteously, and the jailers will be beheaded. Good night. For your father, Johannes Junius. We'll never see you again.
Johannes Junius was beheaded by sword, his remains cremated in the Bamberg witch oven. He was just one victim of a frenzy that swept Europe for 3 centuries, leapt the ocean to America, and claimed 100,000 lives. All were executed for a crime they never committed: witchcraft. Christian witch hunters were spurred on by the highest of authorities, the Bible. Exodus 22, chapter 18 reads, "Thou shalt not suffer a witch to live." But the fear of witches is as old as time.
There was this belief that certain people had certain special powers. The Greeks and the Romans, they would call them pythonesses, women who could foretell the future. The Hebrews had people that they called diviners or seers that they forbade people to go see.
By the Middle Ages, the backbone of Europe was the Roman Catholic Church. The Pope's influence was stronger than any king's. The Church's power rested on the loyalty of its followers, but their loyalty was suspect. Although converts to Christianity, many still practiced pagan rituals.
What was really going on was the church was threatened by the pagans because the pagans had a much better media package than the church did. The pagans were having all the fun, the church was making all the rules. And so the pagans posed a very big threat to that orthodox, constrained lifestyle. And because they were fighting a losing battle, the only thing they could really do is define the pagans as very evil, very undesirable people, and see if they could do everything they could to drive them out of the land.
Originally, witchcraft was the practice of sorcery, simple magic, curing or hurting by the use of a simple spell or a simple remedy, herbs or incantations. In the Middle Ages, witchcraft became something different. It was linked by medieval theologians to worship of Satan.
Augustine, an early Christian theologian, argued that pagan religion and pagan magic were invented by the devil to lure mankind away from Christ. In its war for the hearts and minds of its followers, the church turned folk medicine into devil worship. Since many folk healers were women, their presumed power to cure sickness now exposed them to attack.
What changed in Christian Europe was that these powers became associated more closely with women, and that later they came to be seen primarily as connected with the devil.
Women aren't just women, they have this capacity to be the devil in the shape of a woman. So adultery was commonly thought to be a woman's fault, a woman who had bewitched a man. So you're not just sleeping with a woman, you're sleeping with the devil.
Of the witch began to take shape. Folklore had it that witches would gather in the forest for meetings called sabbats. Here they would fly through the air, mock the church, and pledge their loyalty to Satan. They were said to fornicate with each other, with animals, and with the devil himself. Witches were thought to surround themselves with evil. Demons, in the form of a common pet or farm animal, were a witch's familiar.
The familiar spirit seems to have developed in England, where they thought that the witches were assigned a demon by the devil, and that this demon would probably live in a normal household animal, cleverly disguised, like a cat, like a dog, perhaps a mouse, perhaps a rabbit, perhaps a goat.
Most of a witch's time, it was said, was spent brewing potions. Now the innocent act of using herbs for healing turned sinister.
Most people thought that if you could cure someone, you could also kill them. That if you could make perfumes, you could probably also make a love potion, and perhaps even make poisons.
The very word witch is rooted in the ancient word Wicca.
The origin of that word Wicca is sometimes associated with wisdom, in other times it is associated with meaning to bend. Wicca coming from the idea that one is a bender or shaper. Through magical practices, one would be able to bend or shape reality.
In this superstitious age, a little learning could be a dangerous thing. A woman who knew how to heal naturally was feared by something supernatural. A bad harvest, a disastrous storm, an epidemic of plague, anything whose true cause was unknown could be blamed on a witch. Still, it took time for fear to conquer reason. As late as 1460, a trio of French prelates announced that witches' sabbats simply didn't happen. They were among the last voices of wisdom heard for 3 centuries. Within decades, such talk would be branded heresy. Just as Columbus was contemplating a voyage into the unknown waters of the Atlantic, a cloud of ignorance was descending on Europe.
After 1484, the church took the official position that witches were harmful and that witches were in league with the devil. And this was part of a mass conspiracy to overthrow the Christian world.
It was official. Witchcraft was satanic, the ultimate evil. Kings and commoners now fell into line with the proclamations of the Pope. In its holy war against witchcraft, all the church lacked was a weapon for unmasking witches and destroying them. That weapon was about to arrive. In the late 15th century, 2 German witch hunters, Jakob Sprenger and Heinrich Instatori, wrote to Pope Innocent VIII an alarming letter. The witch hunters had uncovered tolerance for witchcraft within the church itself. Outraged, the Pope encouraged them in writing an exhaustive handbook for persecuting witches. The Malleus Maleficarum, or Hammer Against the Witches, was first printed in 1486 and distributed in half a dozen languages across Europe. It outlined the 4 essential ingredients of witchcraft: renouncing the Christian faith, devoting body and soul to the service of the devil, offering up unbaptized children to the devil, and engaging in orgies that included intercourse with the devil.
It was a book which had more printings than any other book, with the exception of the Bible itself, in the early 16th century. And it was a book that pointed out that witches were everywhere, they were in the service of Satan, and that it was women who were primarily involved in witchcraft.
The reason? According to the book, women were more vulnerable, fickle, carnal, more stupid than men. The Malleus Maleficarum's influence survives to this day.
The concept that we have of witches today, of the old ugly woman stirring a cauldron and cackling and riding a broomstick, probably dates from the mid-1500s. Witches are ugly because, of course, ugliness goes with evil. Witches stir cauldrons because a cauldron was a normal cooking pot in the Middle Ages. Broomsticks. A broomstick is something that every woman in the Middle Ages would have had. It was, again, a common tool associated with women that then became associated with a sort of evil magic.
The Malleus Maleficarum, including how to torture and execute a witch. But most important, how to reveal one. An early test was called swimming the witch. It involved binding the suspect's wrists and throwing her into deep water. If she sank, it was proof that God's water had accepted her. If she floated, the water was rejecting her, and she was a witch. Either way, the verdict could be fatal. Many of the innocent never survived the trial. Another test was even more lopsided. The suspect was placed on one side of the scales and the Bible on the other. If she weighed more than the Holy Book, she was a witch. Proven guilty, the witch was executed by hanging or beheading. Then the corpse was burned at the stake, just to be safe. Justice was swift, but not merciful.
Once a woman was accused of witchcraft, she was tortured until she admitted that she was a witch. And then she was tortured some more until she admitted anything that the inquisitors asked, which included things like having sex with the devil and seeing all of her neighbors at meetings. But there was a lot of pressure put on the women who were accused to name names, to accuse other people. Many of them tried to retract it once the torture had stopped, but they weren't allowed to retract it.
Armed with their zeal and their book, witch hunters scoured Europe for the next 2 centuries, spreading fear and doom. Accusers sometimes had private reasons for pointing a finger. Professional witch hunters went from town to town offering to rid it of witches for a generous fee. Money, not religion, often lay at the root of witch hunting. Accused witches or their families had to pay for their own imprisonment. If suspects had no family, their property could be confiscated to pay their bills. The trial itself offered an opportunity for something besides justice. A popular test for unmasking a witch involved stripping the suspect naked to look for marks of the devil. The courtroom became a forum for voyeurism, 16th century style.
A lot of the witch trials and a lot of the torture and examination and cross-examination of the witches had a very strong sexual component. And because sexuality was so suppressed within the church community and the community as a whole, a lot of these people got their sexual pleasure and their sexual energy out of torturing and examining and pressuring and questioning these people that said they were witches.
Since a mole or birthmark was proof enough, the examiners were rarely disappointed. Midwives, once common in Europe, became another victim of witch hunters and of doctors guarding their turf.
The midwives were persecuted along with the witches because there was a rising medical establishment who really wanted to get rid of them.
Anybody who was a dissenter, a heretic, a Jew, a Muslim, a witch, as they defined them, those people would be demonized and considered to be working for Satan.
Witches fared no better at the hands of the other great heretics of the time, Protestants. When Martin Luther and John Calvin broke from the church in the 16th century, they made sure they were as fanatical as the Catholics in persecuting witches. Said Luther,
"I should have no compassion for these witches. I should burn all of them."
Johannes Junius, the man who left a heart-wrenching letter for his daughter before being put to death as a witch, was executed by the Prince Bishop of Bamberg, Johann Gregor II. During his 10-year reign, Gregor killed more than 600 people in a hall built specifically to jail and torture witches. It was filled with racks, thumbscrews, skull crushers, and leg vices. The atrocities committed within its walls were done in the name of God, but what reigned was unholy terror. If suspects managed to survive the hall, what awaited them outside was even more hellish. Witch hunters considered fire a purifying element, and Gregor followed the usual custom of burning witches at the stake. Yet he added his own gruesome touch. Rather than beheading his victims first, he set them ablaze while they were still alive. In 1669, hysterical children in the Swedish town of Mora swore they had been seized by neighbors and flown to a witch's sabbat. 85 old women were burned at the stake.
In both the 16th and 17th century witch crazes and the modern sex abuse crazes that we're experiencing, children often make the accusations. And the feeling is we should always believe the children. They wouldn't lie and they wouldn't make stuff up. The truth is they do both, as every child psychologist knows.
Children were behind the greatest witch scare in America. It happened in the Massachusetts Bay Colony, where the Puritans settled. They brought with them their fear of witches. As early as 1647, 1 decade after the Puritans landed, witches were tried in Hartford, Connecticut. But the bloodiest witch hunt took place in a small New England village where the devil held court. In 1692, girls in Salem began accusing neighbors of witchcraft. Town leaders investigated. A childish game turned into a witch hunt that trapped hundreds of victims. The Malleus Maleficarum, the centuries-old guide to witch hunting, failed to cover a legal twist introduced at Salem. Spectral evidence. That is testimony based on dreams, fantasies, and hallucinations. Caught up in the hysteria, judges ruled it was admissible. In a kind of wicked catch-22, spectral evidence was proved simply because it could not be disproved. If a witness did run into trouble, she could always fall back on hysterics. She would collapse to the floor, screaming as if tormented. Her arms and legs jerked convulsively. She foamed at the mouth.
They do bad things against their will.
Ironically, if the accused confessed to being a witch, her life was spared. The Puritans would not execute those who admitted their sins. Those who maintained their innocence often did so to their last breath. In all, more than 200 people were accused during the Salem witch trials. 19 were convicted and executed. No one, rich or poor, was immune from this brand of justice.
You are a witch!
One of the differences that we see in America, sort of the dubious side of our more egalitarian culture, is that women of all classes are accused of witchcraft, and much more so than in Europe. And wealthier women end up being executed for witchcraft.
They believed in witches. They saw witches. They accused witches, they persecuted them, they tried them, they tortured them, and they killed them, all in the belief that this was the right thing to do, it was the Christian thing to do. We're saving their souls.
You know how sometimes you get a little...
Almost a century later, in 1782, when a Swiss woman was accused of placing a hex on a child and beheaded. It was the last gasp of fear. By the mid-18th century, science could explain phenomena once blamed on witchcraft. Witchcraft itself still survives, although in a harmless form.
Witchcraft today is quite different from that Western European Christian conception of witchcraft as satanic. There are, of course, some satanic cults today, but the vast majority, the overwhelming majority of people calling themselves witches today have nothing to do with Satanism.
Behold, I have been with you from so many people coming into it, so many people, male and female, saying that they feel like they're coming home when they come to this religion, that something seemed wrong or out of whack or out of balance for them until they found this. Because what it does is it integrates reverence for the earth that people naturally feel.
If witchcraft is alive and well, so is witch hunting. But now it takes a different form.
Hysterical contagion is the phenomenon of an idea or an experience running rampant through a community. And throughout history, we've had many, many, many cases of that. One of the more recent ones was the Pepsi scare, where somebody said that they found a syringe in a Pepsi can. And within weeks, we had several hundred cases phoned in of people finding things in Pepsi cans, when in actuality, nothing was ever found. Once you've defined a group as not you and not belonging to your group and devalued them and made them inhuman, it's not a big leap then to be able to destroy them, kill them, and eliminate them because they're not human.
once accused of witchcraft were often guilty of a crime far more common and more sinister. The crime of being different. Such criminals are found in all cultures through all time. Sheer terror once put to death 100,000 people. But it was the witch hunters themselves who were bewitched, not by hexes or potions, but by the spell of fear.
Coming up next, 16th century South America is about to receive some unwelcome visitors. Are they bold adventurers or brutal killers? Settle.
Between nude layouts in the October 1996 Greek edition of Playboy, there are pictures of a ship called the Leon.
Claim Albert Einstein and other scientists designed a way to make a ship vanish into thin air, literally, and reappear somewhere else. Bizarre or not, the story of teleportation has inspired
visions of a strange world between this one and the next.
And it came in, it kind of did a little thing in the group, and then it was gone.
It was the most extraordinary thing we've ever come across.
Sounds that seem to speak from beyond the grave.
He's trying to give us a message. Please tell me who is here.
From 500-year-old Stirling Castle to an unassuming house in America's heartland, there are bizarre tales being told.
My baby is standing straddled on my neck and it's got a butcher knife shoved down my throat.
Does science have an answer for these fleeting glimpses of a life after death?
There's something still left that needs explaining, which science at the moment doesn't seem to want to look at.
Follow a psychic on his incredible journey inside Alcatraz.
What Joseph is telling me is that he's been shot.
Suicide, unfinished business, lives replaying like an old movie.
This story happened a year ago. We lived in a townhouse in the suburbs. Pretty safe area. There had been some robberies a couple blocks away, but they weren't common, and I felt pretty safe walking home alone at night.